Okay, so the ideas behind intelligence testing and intelligence in general have evolved over the years. And so we're going to take a look at how that happens in this field of psychology. So, testing today, most common tests given to children are the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, or the WISC-4. And so those are the most commonly used intelligence testings for our children today. And then for adults, there is an intelligence test that exists, and it's the Wechsler Adults Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. And what we find in these two Wechsler tests, which are again, kind of the gold standard for intelligence testing today, are 6 different types of questions. One's about information, just basic information. Another might be on comprehension, that is, can you read this and understand it? Arithmetic shows up, basic math functionalities. Similarities, being able to compare two different things or things that are alike, trying to kind of compare them across each other. Digit span, which is short-term memory questions, also show up. So based off these 6 types of questions, the idea is they can basically pinpoint your intelligence level using strictly those types of questions. And that's the Wechsler one. And again, that is the most common type of IQ test. So if you've taken an IQ test before, you've most likely taken that. Although sometimes you may have taken the Stanford Binet. And in today, there is kind of debates raging about intelligence, although very clearly there is a winner coming to the front, and that is the theory of multiple intelligences, and we'll deal with that later. But the debate about intelligence arose about whether there is one specific set of abilities or many different sets of abilities, and what makes intelligence. Is it one thing or is it many things? And again, I think by now we all recognize that it is in fact many things. There's not one thing that makes intelligence, but rather there are many, many things. And so that's where we're at now, but it wasn't always that way. And so Charles Spearman is one of these men who was thinking about intelligence, and he argued that there's something called general intelligence, or the G factor, and he just called it G. And he said that this G was the basis for all other intelligence, and that we could figure out your intelligence based off simply this G factor. So that's where we've got going on there. And then Robert Sternberg comes along and says that intelligence can actually be defined as having 3 major components. Not a singular G, but rather 3 components that are analytical, practical, and creative. And using each of those, we could then figure out our intelligence. And then after Sternberg came Lewis Thurston, and he argued that people need to think more broadly about intelligence because it can come in many different forms. It's not just confined to traditional intelligence as we may think or know it to be, but rather it can manifest itself in just countless different ways, and so we should be aware of that and keep caution to that as we go through it. And so Thurston's work is kind of reaches its capstone in the work of Howard Gardner. And Howard Gardner proposes this theory of multiple intelligences, which argues that there are many different types of intelligences, and that people can learn in many different ways, and people can be intelligent in many different ways. And Gardner identifies 8 different types of intelligence. He argues for verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, musical, spatial, kinesthetic, environmental, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. And he argues that kind of our society today places more value on the verbal and mathematic, and he makes that argument by basically looking at the modern school system, where those tend to be more emphasized than others. And so we've got that. But he also says that there's value in all the other types of intelligence, and that we should be aware of them, and we should be kind of looking to make sure that we recognize the importance of all of these types of intelligence. And so that's that, and we can dive more deeply into each of those types of intelligences at a later state. But those are the main ones that are proposed. And then Daniel Goleman comes along and begins promoting an idea of emotional intelligence and argues that in addition to these types of intelligences, there is something called an emotional intelligence, and being in tune with one's feelings and others' feelings is a type of intelligence as well. And although that fits kind of sort of under the interpersonal and intrapersonal of Howard Gardner, Goleman takes it even a step further to begin this arguing for the emotional intelligence point. And so that's Goleman's work. Looking at the kind of further understanding of environment and intelligence, psychologists have been trying to figure out how much our intelligence is shaped by what we inherit, and how much of it is shaped by the world around us. And so what they've done is they've decided to measure the influence of heredity on intelligence through something called a heritability coefficient. So they create a coefficient, and of course in psychology coefficients are anywhere between 0 and 1. The closer it is to 1, the stronger the correlation it is that exists. And this can indicate roughly how much variation among individuals is the result of differences in genetics. So how much is hereditary versus how much is environmental. And so the way to best do this for intelligence, as with many other things when we're trying to compare humans to humans, is to use twin studies. And twin studies are important because twins have identical twins have identical DNA, and so then we can measure, okay, so how much of your intelligence is based off that identical DNA versus how much is a result of your environment that you were raised in. And so what happens is when comparing the IQs of identical twins raised separately, we get a heritability quotient of 0.6 to 0.8. And then when identical twins raised together and fraternal twins raised together tend to have a heritability quotient around 0.75. So based off this information and then some other work outside of these twin studies, psychologists believe the true heritability quotient for an IQ to be about 0.6. That is around half, and then at the end they conclude about half the variation amongst people is based off heredity. That is, half of the differences in intelligence is based off your genes, and the other half is based off the environment in which you are raised. So that should be empowering in recognizing that you can cut or adjust the difference in intelligence by half of just about anybody, based off of this idea that half of your intelligence is, or half the difference in intelligence, I should say, comes from genes and the other half is from the environment. So if you adjust your environment, you can adjust, of course, your performance. And so psychologists have found that within the human population there is just vast diversity, and although IQs tend to be standardly and normally distributed, there is a lot of difference within that normal distribution curve. Again, normal distribution curves are the Bell models. They follow standard deviations. And so what we find is that a large majority of people have an IQ of about 100. That tends to be the average IQ, is 100. But there's variation within that. And so what do we do with this information? So what has happened in society is we've labeled people either intellectually disabled or gifted based off where they fall on this IQ spectrum. So sometimes we use these high IQs as a way to determine that people are gifted. And so if you have an IQ that falls in the 99th percentile, that is an IQ that is higher than about 135. So you're more than it's like more than 2.5 standard deviations above the norm. You tend to be considered gifted, although that is not a set standard. Not everyone says, well, that's the measurement for gifted. And other things besides IQ can be used to determine whether or not you are gifted. What's interesting is that giftedness does not always mean success, and various psychologists have found this by studying and following people who are tested as gifted and then following them into adulthood, and they find that not all of them are successful, and the argument is that there's lots of other variables that come into play And one of the ones that they point out as being one of the major factors into whether someone who is gifted will be successful is the socioeconomic status of parents. And that is, if your parents are successful, if your parents are comfortable in their economic situation and you are gifted, then you are likely to be successful. But if your parents are struggling to make ends meet, or in a traditionally disenfranchised or lower socioeconomic social group or ethnic group, then just because you are gifted does not guarantee you have success, because there are many more obstacles in your way. So just because you have a high IQ does not mean you'll be successful. And just because you have a high IQ does not mean you're automatically classified as gifted. There's variation. On the other end of the spectrum, you have intellectual disabilities, and that refers to low levels of intelligence and low levels of adaptive behavior. So that is, if someone has a low IQ, that alone does not necessarily mean they are intellectually disabled. They must also show a low level of adaptive competence, and that is, they would have a difficult time succeeding in the world. They would have a tough time interacting in the world and being successful in a daily lifestyle. That, combined with a low IQ, can lead us to classify various people as intellectually disabled. And intellectual disability is on it can be categorized on a severity range. It's not just one type, of course. And that severity ranges from mild, which is an IQ of about 50 to 70, all the way to profound, which is an IQ of 25 or below. And within that, there's varying other levels as well. So within the human population, there is vast diversity. Most people are right around the IQ of 100, but there are people who are higher or lower on the spectrum than that. Again, it tends to follow a bell curve.